There are ruins that feel ancient, distant, almost polite in the way they stand before you. You look at the broken columns, the fallen stones, the bits of wall still clinging to shape, and your mind quietly files them into the category of history. Finished things, dead civilizations, completed stories. Pompeii does not do that. Pompeii feels wrong. It feels less like a ruin than like an interruption. Less like the remains of a lost world than like the moment after a door has slammed and everyone inside has gone silent. Because the horror of Pompeii is not simply that a city was destroyed. Cities are destroyed all through history. The horror is that Pompeii was still in the middle of being itself. People there were still making plans, still running businesses, still repainting rooms, still flirting, cheating, praying, bargaining, eating, gossiping, bragging, borrowing money, writing insults on walls, fixing earthquake damage, and assuming there would be another day to finish whatever they had left unfinished. That is what makes Pompeii unbearable in a way grander tragedies sometimes are not. It was not a legendary city falling from an impossible height. It was ordinary life, in all its vanity and appetite and routine, cut off so violently that nearly 2,000 years later it still feels indecent to stare at it for too long. And people do stare. They have stared for centuries. They come to Pompeii looking for tragedy, but also for something else, something they may not say aloud because it sounds ugly when spoken plainly. They come for intimacy. They come because Pompeii offers the illusion that we can catch human life unguarded. Not kings posing for monuments, not generals arranging their legacy, not poets polishing the story afterward. Just people. Real people, in a real town, on the edge of an ordinary afternoon they did not know would become one of the most famous catastrophes in history. That is why Pompeii has always pulled at the imagination harder than many places technically more important. Not because it was Rome. It was not Rome. Not because it was the center of power. It was not. But because when Pompeii died, it preserved something history usually destroys first, the texture of daily life. And that daily life was not noble, it was not clean, it was not solemn. Pompeii was beautiful in places, yes, and wealthy in places, and cultured in places, but it was also loud, commercial, sexual, ambitious, dirty, competitive, superstitious, and full of people performing versions of themselves for others. Which is to say, it was human. Very human. More human in some ways than the polished marble image people like to build around the ancient world. If you want Rome as a philosophical abstraction, Pompeii is not the best place. If you want Rome as smell and appetite and money and vanity and heat and graffiti and gossip and anxiety and self-display, Pompeii gets much closer. It is one of the reasons the place feels so modern, not because the people thought like us in every way. They did not. But because they worried about status, desired pleasure, exaggerated their importance, mocked each other, sold things, renovated their houses, chased advantage, and convinced themselves that the instability around them was manageable. That last part matters more than almost anything else. Because Pompeii did not simply live under a volcano in the way modern textbooks make it sound, as though everyone were foolishly picnicking at the foot of a giant warning sign. That is far too simple. People in the Bay of Naples lived in one of the most attractive regions of the Roman world. The land was fertile, the climate was generous, the sea connected them to trade and movement and opportunity. Villas glittered along the coast, towns prospered, wealthy Romans loved the region, and the mountain itself, Vesuvius, did not present itself to them as the clear, theatrical villain it is to us. We know the ending. They did not. We look at that landscape and see risk outlined in red. They looked at it and saw productive land, beauty, and a familiar horizon. That difference is the whole tragedy. Disaster is easy to identify after it has chosen its victims. Pompeii sat near the Bay of Naples, not isolated, not forgotten, but well positioned in a region threaded with commerce, travel, and agricultural wealth. Before it was thoroughly Roman, it had already lived several lives under different influences. Oscan, Greek, Samnite, Roman. Layers on layers. Like many places in Italy, it was not born one thing and then forever stayed that thing. It evolved through conquest, adaptation, prestige, and practical necessity. By the time it was fully folded into the Roman world, Pompeii was a thriving town with a personality of its own. Not the capital of anything vast, but a place substantial enough to matter and prosperous enough to attract ambition. It had forums, temples, bathhouses, theatres, workshops, shops, taverns, private houses from modest to luxurious, and all the architectural language of urban Roman life. It belonged to that Roman habit of taking power and turning it into space. Streets, walls, courtyards, public buildings, domestic decoration, inscriptions, all of it carrying little signals about who mattered, who paid, who aspired, and who wanted to be seen. That desire to be seen runs through Pompeii everywhere. It is in the houses with their carefully arranged reception spaces where visitors would enter and absorb the owner's taste, wealth, and claim to status. It is in the frescoes that covered walls in reds, blacks, yellows, mythological scenes, gardens, architectural fantasies. It is in the mosaics underfoot, in the fountains, in the small shrines, in the public inscriptions endorsing political candidates, in the election notices painted onto walls by supporters or hired painters. Even a provincial town understood the Roman truth that private comfort and public image were rarely separate things. A house was not just a house, it was a statement. A dinner was not just a meal, it was theatre. Generosity was not always generosity. It could be advertising in noble dress. But before we get to the polished rooms and decorated walls, it helps to strip away the museum silence that now hangs over Pompeii, and imagine what it actually felt like when it was alive. Not looked at, lived in. Morning came with movement, noise, deliveries, footsteps, voices, shutters, animals, workers, customers, smoke, bread, water, and waste. Streets were not charming little lanes in the way tourists sometimes want ancient streets to be. They were functional, crowded, uneven, dirty. Wheel ruts cut into stone remind you that carts passed through repeatedly, grinding use into the ground itself. Stepping stones across certain streets helped people cross when water and filth collected. Public fountains supplied water. Shops opened onto the street. Businesses and homes mingled. The division between domestic and commercial space could be much looser than a modern suburban imagination expects. You lived near work, inside work, above work, around work. And the smells would have been impossible to romanticize if you stood there in the heat long enough. Cooking, sweat, sewage, animals, fish sauce, wet stone, smoke, human density. The Romans were capable of immense refinement, but refinement existed inside a world that still smelled like bodies and trade. Pompeii was not some marble perfume commercial. It was urban life. Bakeries turned grain into bread with industrial seriousness. Mills powered by animals ground flour. We can still see ovens, counters, equipment. There were fulleries too, where cloth was cleaned and processed in ways that would make modern people recoil if they let themselves think too clearly about it. Textile work, food production, retail, craft, all of it embedded into the town's daily pulse. Pompeii was not merely a stage set of villas for the rich, it was a machine that needed labor. That fact matters because one of the things disaster often erases is hierarchy of visibility. We remember the polished frescoes and the shocking casts, but Pompeii also belonged to bakers, tavern keepers, enslaved workers, laborers, sex workers, merchants, freedmen building status, artisans, children, old people, clients, patrons, priests, officials, and all the people history usually flattens unless something extraordinary traps them in place. And then there were the bathhouses, because no understanding of Roman urban life works without them. To modern people they can sound luxurious, and they were in a sense, but also practical, social, performative, and political. Bathing was not just hygiene, it was rhythm, ritual, conversation, display. A place where bodies were seen, news circulated, alliances formed, judgments made. Pompeii had these spaces because Roman life was intensely public in ways many people today would find exhausting. The self was always being seen, assessed, placed. Your clothes, your house, your dinner invitations, your patron connections, your public generosity, your tastes, your body, your speech, your inscriptions on walls, all of it fed into a social ecosystem that was never fully private. Which brings us to one of the things that makes Pompeii so irresistible to modern audiences. The walls talk. They really do. Graffiti survives there in quantities that can feel startlingly intimate. Political endorsements, jokes, boasts, insults, advertisements, crude remarks, declarations of love, casual obscenities, names, fragments of lives. This is one of the reasons Pompeii never stays safely monumental. The walls keep breaking the spell of noble antiquity. They remind you that ancient people also wrote nonsense, flirted badly, praised favorites, insulted rivals, and left traces not meant for eternity. A city that can give you elegant frescoes in one building and a scribbled vulgarity in another is a city that refuses to sit still as an idealized past. Some graffiti advertised gladiatorial games. Some backed candidates for office. Some recorded desire in the blunt language desire often takes when nobody expects schoolchildren centuries later to read it. Some may have been jokes between friends. Some may have been serious. And there is a trap here that modern viewers fall into again and again. The temptation to turn every fragment into a full dramatic story. One lover, one betrayal, one scandal, one doomed affair. Sometimes that may be close to the truth. Often it is fantasy layered onto scraps. Pompeii encourages projection because it gives us so much texture and so many gaps. Human beings cannot tolerate textured gaps for long. We want to fill them with plot. That has happened especially with sex. Pompeii has become famous or notorious, depending on the moral tone of the speaker, for erotic art, phallic imagery, and the remains of spaces long interpreted through the lens of prostitution and desire. And here, as everywhere in Pompeii, the truth is more interesting than the cheap version, but less convenient for clickbait. Yes, sexual imagery appears in Pompeii. Yes, there were brothels. Yes, prostitution existed in Roman society and was integrated into its economic and social realities in ways that do not map neatly onto modern categories. Yes, some wall paintings and objects are openly erotic by any reasonable definition. But no, that does not mean Pompeii was uniquely depraved, or that every erotic image proves some vast feverish citywide obsession. Roman visual culture used sexuality, fertility symbols, humor, power display, and protective imagery in ways that modern viewers often misread. A carved phallus in a domestic or street context did not automatically carry the same singular meaning it would in a modern respectable neighborhood. It could function epitropeically, as a sign tied to luck or warding off evil. Sex could be symbolic, commercial, comic, social, and hierarchical all at once. One of the most famous places in Pompeii is the so-called brothel, often presented as though the city handed us a perfectly preserved red light district with explanatory diagrams. The reality is less neat. There is certainly strong evidence for commercial sex in Pompeii, including spaces plausibly used that way, but modern narratives have often exaggerated certainty or turned ambiguous evidence into lurid confidence. Were all erotic paintings ads? Not necessarily. Did every small room with suggestive decoration mean prostitution happened there? No. Was Pompeii uniquely obsessed with sex compared to the broader Roman world? That claim is hard to support. Pompeii is preserved unusually well, which means it often looks more excessive simply because more of it survived. A culture can seem dirtier when more of its walls are still standing. And yet you cannot talk honestly about Pompeii without admitting that desire, pleasure, status, and display are everywhere in it. Dinner parties mattered, reputation mattered, bodies mattered, patronage mattered. Dining rooms were designed for impression as much as eating. Wealthy households staged themselves with exquisite care. Guests entered through carefully managed spaces. Views were curated, decorations were chosen to say something. Mythological paintings did not just prettify walls, they signaled education, taste, cultural aspiration, familiarity with stories that could flatter the owner by association. You were not simply feeding people, you were arranging their experience of you. The Roman house, especially in more elite hands, was a machine of controlled visibility. A visitor could be led through a sequence that revealed just enough, at just the right pace, to establish the owner's standing. Atrium, light, water, color, columns, framed perspectives, garden illusion, luxury objects. Even the architecture could perform power by choreographing movement and attention. This mattered in Pompeii because although it was not the imperial center, it was still a place where people competed. Local elites sought prestige through public works, political office, generosity, and domestic magnificence. Wealth had to be converted into recognition. Recognition had to be stabilized through repetition. That is one of the reasons Roman urban life can feel exhausting to modern readers. So much energy went into being legible to others, and if you think this made dinner more relaxing, it did not. It made dinner political. Reclining at a meal could be pleasurable, sophisticated, indulgent, but also carefully coded. Who was invited? In what rank? Under what obligations? To dine well in Pompeii might mean living inside a network of debts, favors, expectations, resentments, and ambitions dressed in polished form. One reason ancient gossip attaches so easily to places like Pompeii is that the social world itself was built for scrutiny. Who visited whom? Who rose? Who married well? Who spent too much? Who decorated tastelessly? Who sponsored games? Who was sleeping with whom? We are not always lucky enough to know the answers, but the city preserves the atmosphere of people who would very much have cared. Religion sat inside all this, not far off in a special isolated box called spirituality, but woven through daily life. Pompeii had temples, shrines, rituals, official cults, local devotions, household worship. The Roman religious world was not simple belief versus disbelief. It was practice, maintenance, reciprocity, observance, identity, public order, family continuity, placemaking. Household shrines known as lararia remind us that even domestic life sat under divine watch and protection. The gods were not abstract ideas hovering above existence. They were part of its management. You honored them, invoked them, petitioned them, thanked them, sometimes feared them, and read signs through them. In a world without our categories of secular certainty, the boundaries between natural event, divine displeasure, omen, and political meaning could blur quickly, which is why later readers have always been tempted to imagine Pompeii full of warnings before the eruption. Strange skies, nervous animals, omens ignored, priests whispering, citizens laughing off the gods. It is a very satisfying story, too satisfying. The truth is that ancient people did care about omens and signs, but that does not mean they could decode the future with cinematic clarity. Real warning often looks like background disturbance until afterward. Real warning becomes obvious only once the event arrives and rearranges memory around itself. And Pompeii had already been living with disturbance for years. This matters more than almost any lurid tale. In 62 CE, nearly 2 decades before the famous eruption, usually dated to 79 CE, a major earthquake struck the region. The exact scale and local effects are debated in detail by scholars, but there is no doubt it caused serious damage. Buildings were affected, repairs began, reconstruction continued for years. Some parts of Pompeii were still in process when the eruption came. That fact changes the emotional shape of the story. Pompeii was not a city floating in complacent perfection until disaster struck out of a blue sky. It was a city accustomed to damage, accustomed to repair, accustomed to instability being folded into normal life. And that is one of the most modern things about Pompeii. Human beings are astonishingly capable of adapting to recurring danger as long as danger does not force immediate surrender. A few tremors, some cracked plaster, some rebuilding, some anxiety. Then trade continues, meals continue, politics continue, weddings continue. People get used to the strange thing because they have to. They normalize what they can survive. By the time a threat becomes structurally woven into ordinary life, it often stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like reality's annoying personality. That is exactly the kind of psychological condition in which catastrophe can rip through a population that believes itself experienced, practical, and basically in control. So when we imagine Pompeii before the eruption, we should not imagine people constantly trembling at the mountain in superstitious terror. Nor should we imagine them stupidly carefree as though the entire bay were populated by fools. Better to imagine something harder and truer. People who had reasons to stay, reasons to build, reasons to trust tomorrow, because too much in life depends on acting as if tomorrow exists. The region was prosperous. The soils enriched by volcanic processes were fertile. The bay was desirable. Wealth clustered there for a reason. Vesuvius, before it became the symbol of catastrophe, belonged to a beautiful and productive landscape. We know the mountain as a destroyer because it won the final argument. Before that, it fed the land. Ancient understanding of volcanoes did not operate with our geological clarity. Even the mountain's appearance before the eruption may not have signaled to local inhabitants what it would signal to us. The classic clean image of a famous dangerous volcano in the modern imagination does not help much here. The mountain was part of life. Familiarity is one of the great sedatives. It takes something already known and wraps threat inside habit. And yet the last days must have carried signs, though not necessarily signs in the melodramatic sense later storytellers crave. There were likely tremors. There may have been disturbances people noticed and judged against prior experience. The problem is not that there were no warnings. The problem is that warning is not the same as interpretation. A strange event does not arrive with a label attached saying, "This one is different. This one is fatal. This one will separate your life into before and after." More often it resembles previous unease until it exceeds the category. This is where so much bad storytelling about Pompeii goes wrong. It wants certainty where the evidence gives us fragments. It wants the thrilling image of a city knowingly partying under doom, or the image of everyone instantly understanding they were under divine judgment, or the image of wise few fleeing while the decadent many laughed. Those versions flatter the narrator because they impose moral order on chaos. Real life is messier. Some people may have left earlier. Some may have worried more than others. Some may have been numb to tremors after years of disturbance. Some may have considered moving impossible. Some may simply have been busy. Catastrophe usually meets people in the middle of tasks. Then the eruption began. Not with the mythic satisfaction of instant annihilation, but with confusion. That is almost always how disaster opens. A thing happens. Then people try to fit it into a known frame. A problem to be managed, a temporary danger, a severe but survivable interruption. In the case of Vesuvius, the eruption column rose high into the sky, feeding what later accounts and geological study help us imagine as an immense plume of ash, pumice, and gas. Pliny the Younger, writing afterward, would compare the shape to a pine tree, an image that has followed the event through history. But inside Pompeii, whatever people saw first, they were not watching a documentary reconstruction with explanatory subtitles. They were in it. Imagine the first phase not as clean apocalypse, but as escalating wrongness. The sky altered, material began to fall. Noise unsettled the air, confusion spread through streets and courtyards. People looked upward, outward, toward family, toward property, toward doors, toward neighbors. What is this? How bad? Will it stop? Should we go? Where? What do we take? If you survive the early moments of a disaster, the disaster becomes partly a crisis of decision. Delay can kill, panic can kill, false confidence can kill, attachment can kill, hope badly timed can kill. Pumice fell, ash accumulated, roofs became vulnerable under weight, passage grew harder, breathing worsened, darkness could thicken, the environment itself began turning against ordinary movement. And here again there is a popular simplification to resist. Pompeii was not preserved in one single still frame by one single simple mechanism. Death came in different ways at different moments. Some people likely died from structural collapse. Some from suffocation or the conditions created by ashfall. Others, especially in later phases, from pyroclastic surges or flows, though the exact distribution and sequence across areas must be discussed with care. The science matters because myth loves a dramatic single explanation, while reality usually offers a layered one. But before the science, there are the decisions. Some people fled, some stayed inside, some gathered valuables. Some took what they could carry and tried to move through a world turning opaque and unstable. The evidence of objects found with victims can be heartbreaking, because it records the human instinct to hold on to importance even while the world is ending. Jewelry, money, portable goods. Things chosen under pressure tell you what a person still believed would matter if only they could get out. That is one of the cruelest parts of Pompeii. We do not only see death there, we see priorities arrested mid-justification. And not everyone who stayed indoors was foolish. In certain disasters, shelter is survival. In others, it becomes a trap. That is one reason judgment after the fact is obscene. To stay might have felt safer than crossing streets under falling debris. To move might have felt urgent if walls were cracking and roofs threatening collapse. To wait for a better moment might have seemed rational until the better moment never came. The same event can punish opposite instincts. Families likely gathered, people likely called names into noise. Some may have been separated, some may have gone back for others, some may have hesitated for possessions. Some may have thought the worst had passed only to be caught by what followed. Ancient death often comes to us abstractly, but Pompeii makes it local. A doorway, a room, a staircase, a street, a courtyard, a body found with another, a shape collapsed in a posture that seems intimate or desperate, or both. We must be careful not to fabricate emotional specifics where the evidence cannot support them. And yet the emotional force is real even without invention. The city was full of unfinished human intentions. That alone is enough. The famous casts contribute enormously to that force, though they also create misunderstandings. In the 19th century, Giuseppe Fiorelli developed the technique of pouring plaster into voids left in the hardened ash where bodies had decomposed. The resulting forms gave the world some of Pompeii's most haunting images. Human figures apparently fixed in their last positions, dogs contorted against restraint, the negative spaces of life made visible by filling absence. These casts are so powerful that they have shaped public imagination more than almost any scholarly article ever could. People look at them and feel they are looking directly at the last instant of suffering. In a sense, they are. In another sense, they are looking at an interpretive procedure layered onto the archaeological record. The forms are profoundly moving, but they are not transparent windows into a single frozen second exactly as lived. They are the product of bodies leaving cavities, of excavation choices, of plaster filling loss. The emotional truth is overwhelming. The forensic truth is more complicated. That complication matters because Pompeii has suffered from its own fame. The more emotionally gripping the site becomes, the more people want clean narratives. The mother shielding child, the lovers dying together, the sinner punished, the wealthy fool clutching gold. Sometimes the evidence may support part of such a story. Often it does not. One of the ongoing responsibilities of studying Pompeii is resisting the urge to turn every powerful image into a complete morally satisfying plot. Ancient people deserve better than our sentimental convenience. Still, even stripped of exaggeration, the event remains monstrous. Pyroclastic currents and surges associated with explosive eruptions are not cinematic in the way ordinary language can bear. They can move with terrifying speed and lethal heat. The ancient inhabitants did not possess the modern conceptual vocabulary to understand what was overtaking them. And that is another brutal feature of catastrophe. People can die inside a process they do not intellectually possess. They experience effects without mastering the phenomenon. Darkness, heat, gases, collapse, confusion, terror. Knowledge lags behind force. Pliny the Younger gives us the most famous literary witness connected to the eruption, though not as a man standing in Pompeii narrating every street. He was across the bay at Misenum and later wrote letters to Tacitus describing what happened, including the actions of his uncle Pliny the Elder, the naturalist and naval commander who attempted to observe and then respond to the disaster. Pliny the Elder's death became part of the event's legendary frame, the learned man confronting extraordinary nature and not surviving it. The younger Pliny's account is invaluable, vivid, and justly famous. It gives us descriptions of the cloud, of fear, of darkness, of ash, of uncertainty, of people reacting in radically human ways. It also has limits. It cannot answer every question about what happened in each part of Pompeii at each hour. One witness, however brilliant, does not dissolve all ambiguity. That is important because modern storytelling often squeezes more certainty out of Pliny than his text can honestly provide. And ambiguity is not the enemy here. Ambiguity is part of why Pompeii still feels alive as a subject. We know enough to feel the horror, not enough to flatten it. That balance is rare and potent. What followed the destruction was not immediate memorialization in the way modern disasters produce monuments, archives, names, interviews, footage, and legal records. Pompeii was buried, smothered under volcanic material. Its urban life stopped. Survivors, if and where they existed, moved into a different world, structured by loss, displacement, and practical aftermath. The city did not become at once a museum, it became absence. Over time, knowledge of the exact site dimmed. Memory persisted in some forms, but the city itself slid away physically and psychologically. This too is part of Pompeii's strange power. It did not only die, it vanished in place. The town remained there beneath, while the living world moved above and beyond it. Centuries passed, layers accumulated. Curiosity survived, treasure-seeking emerged. What we call rediscovery was not one pure noble archaeological moment in which enlightened minds gently brushed away soil to recover truth. Of course not. Human beings are rarely that elegant. Early exploration of buried Vesuvian sites involved treasure hunting, courtly interest, prestige, extraction, and uneven understanding. The Bourbon rulers of Naples had reasons of state and display to care about such finds. Europe developed a hunger for antiquity that mixed scholarship with appetite, status, collecting, and spectacle. Objects were prized, frescoes could be removed. Context, by modern archaeological standards, could be damaged or lost. Pompeii's second life began partly as sensation, that is fitting in a dark way. A city once built on display became famous again by being displayed. And Europe was captivated, not simply because Roman ruins were impressive, but because Pompeii offered something more invasive: domestic antiquity. Not only temples and inscriptions, but rooms, dishes, graffiti, ordinary objects, intimate spaces. It was as though the ancient world had stopped mid-breath. Painters, writers, collectors, tourists, intellectuals, moralists, voyeurs, all found in Pompeii something they could use. Some saw warnings about decadence, some saw proof of Rome's sophistication, some saw the thrill of bodies and bedrooms, some saw archaeological gold, some saw a kind of sentimental bridge to the dead. Pompeii was endlessly recruitable, it still is. Modern visitors often arrive with a set of ready-made feelings and images already installed in their minds: the doomed lovers, the plaster casts, the brothel, the volcano, the tragedy. Then they walk the streets and discover something subtler and more disturbing. Pompeii is huge enough, detailed enough, ordinary enough that tragedy keeps colliding with routine. A bakery here, a garden there, an election slogan, a mosaic at a threshold, a painting of a god, a tiny room, a water basin, a courtyard catching sunlight, then suddenly evidence of death, then domestic decoration again. The place denies the neat emotional compartmentalization people often want. It does not let you keep catastrophe over there while admiring art over here. They are tangled. That is why the sight can feel overwhelming even when not much dramatic action is happening around you. The drama is embedded in the fact that all these ordinary things belong to people who assumed continuance and did not get it. And the ordinary things matter immensely for Roman history. Pompeii is not valuable merely because it died spectacularly. It is valuable because destruction preserved things textual sources alone would never have given us with such richness. Urban layout, domestic decoration, food practices, commercial spaces, political messages, religious habits, social aspiration, the materiality of daily Roman life. If all we had were literary elites writing from the upper levels of culture, the Roman world would look different, cleaner, more controlled by rhetoric. Pompeii drags us downward and sideways into lived environment. It lets archaeology argue with literature. It also reminds us how incomplete even a spectacular site can be. People sometimes speak of Pompeii as a perfect snapshot, a city frozen in total completeness. That is not right. Preservation was extraordinary, but not total. Recovery has been shaped by excavation history, damage, looting, interpretation, reconstruction, loss, weathering, and the biases of those who studied and displayed it. A snapshot, even when unusually rich, is still framed. What survives is never everything. The temptation to treat Pompeii as an absolutely transparent window into Roman life is another myth that must be resisted. It is a rare window, yes. A complete one, no. The same goes for moral narratives. Few stories have been more tempting over the centuries than the claim that Pompeii was destroyed for its sins. You can hear how easily that idea travels. A city famous for erotic imagery, pleasure, luxury, and Roman appetite is consumed by fire and ash beneath a terrifying mountain. It is exactly the kind of pattern moralists adore: vice, warning, punishment. But history is not obligated to flatter moralists. There is no serious basis for treating the eruption as some cosmic verdict on Pompeian behavior. That interpretation tells us far more about later people's need to organize disaster into moral theater than about the ancient city itself. Human beings cannot tolerate meaningless destruction for long, so they retrofit justice onto it. But if Pompeii was not destroyed because it was exceptionally sinful, was it exceptionally decadent? Again, that word can mislead. It was Roman, which means it contained luxury, hierarchy, exploitation, appetite, display, cruelty, refinement, and pleasure in combinations that modern people may alternately glamorize or condemn, depending on mood. Some houses were lavish, some lives were hard. Enslavement structured parts of the economy and domestic world. Commercial sex existed, status competition was intense. Public entertainment could be brutal. None of this makes Pompeii uniquely monstrous. It makes it recognizably Roman, and perhaps recognizably human. Prosperity often arrives wrapped around systems people prefer not to inspect too closely. Then there is the erotic question again, because modern fascination never lets it rest. Was Pompeii more sexually explicit than other Roman cities? Or did it simply preserve more evidence? The second possibility is often stronger. Archaeology can distort by abundance. If fragments of other places survive less well, Pompeii can end up looking singular where it may actually be unusually visible. Modern viewers, meanwhile, carry their own obsessions into the site. They want the ancient world to confess either innocence or scandal. Pompeii offers neither. It offers complexity. Sexuality there can be commercial, humorous, symbolic, decorative, hierarchical, and frankly explicit, without neatly matching modern categories of private morality. And that is one reason the city still unsettles. It refuses clean translation. The people there were not us. But they were not incomprehensible aliens either. We can recognize their ambitions, their vanity, their jokes, their need for status, their domestic pride, their public posturing. Then suddenly we hit something culturally strange, morally difficult, or symbolically unfamiliar, and the recognition cracks. Pompeii keeps us moving between intimacy and distance, close enough to feel, far enough to resist complete possession. It also exposes a darker element in modern fascination: voyeurism. That word sounds harsh, but it belongs here. People come to Pompeii not only to admire archaeology, but to look into private lives breached by catastrophe. Bedrooms, kitchens, bodily traces, erotic images, casts of the dead. We tell ourselves this is historical interest. And often it is, but not only that. There is also the thrill of safe proximity to disaster, to see where life was interrupted, to imagine last moments, to stare at suffering that can no longer object. Pompeii allows this in a way many other ancient sites do not, because the intimacy of preservation is so intense. The city offers access, and access can slide into appetite. We should be honest about that, because honesty improves respect. It is better to admit the uncomfortable pull than to disguise it as pure piety. Tourism has only intensified this. Pompeii exists now not just as archaeological site, but as cultural icon, educational resource, emotional machine, economic asset, and media object. Films, documentaries, novels, textbooks, clickbait articles, dramatic reconstructions, moral essays, social media clips, all keep feeding the city back into the modern mind. Each retelling chooses emphasis: sex, science, tragedy, luxury, doom, ordinary life, mystery. Some do it carefully, some do it badly. Pompeii survives not just under the ground, but inside constant reuse. Yet for all the exploitation, something essential resists corruption. Stand long enough with the evidence, and the city still pushes back against simplification. You cannot reduce it to disaster porn if you actually pay attention. The walls insist on daily life, the streets insist on labor, the houses insist on social choreography, the shrines insist on practice, the graffiti insist on ordinary minds, the repairs insist on resilience, the casts insist on mortality. No single tone can absorb all of Pompeii. That is why the best narrations about it should not rush. They should move through appetite and architecture, status and superstition, warning and denial, catastrophe and afterlife, because only then does the city begin to feel proportionate to itself. And perhaps the deepest reason Pompeii remains so powerful is that it does not merely tell us ancient people died. Of course they died. Everyone knows that in the abstract. What Pompeii tells us is that ordinary life can remain psychologically ordinary right up to the edge of annihilation. People can keep scheduling tomorrow while the conditions of tomorrow are collapsing beneath them. They can repaint a wall in a damaged city. They can pursue profit after an earthquake. They can flirt under a mountain. They can keep calling danger manageable because manageable danger is the only kind that allows breakfast, taxes, errands, politics, and sleep. This is not stupidity. It is one of the core operating methods of human life. If we truly felt every risk in proportion to its possible consequence, civilization might stop moving entirely. So Pompeii is not just ancient history. It is a case study in normalization. A prosperous place adapts to recurring disturbance. Repair becomes routine. Threat becomes landscape. Beauty helps sedate attention. Social life continues. Then the long-negotiated danger stops negotiating. That pattern is not trapped in antiquity. It is one of the oldest human habits there is. And still, for all the warning people like to extract from Pompeii, the site refuses to be only a moral lesson. It is too personal for that, too detailed, too full of smallness. A threshold mosaic, a painted garden, a loaf carbonized in an oven, a scratched name, a wall under repair, a shrine in a home, a room designed to impress, a street cut by wheels, a cast of a body where a body once struggled. These things do not line up into slogan-sized wisdom. They line up into something messier and more honest. The fact that human life is mostly made of ordinary acts that never imagine themselves historical. That may be the most haunting thing of all. Nobody in Pompeii woke that morning thinking, today my cup, my lamp, my joke on a wall, my household shrine, my half-finished repair, my dinner arrangement, my argument, my little box of money, my body, will become evidence. Evidence for strangers, evidence for schoolchildren, evidence for scholars, evidence for tourists with cameras and guides and bottled water, evidence for people who will use me to tell stories about my civilization. They were not posing for history, they were interrupted by it. And because they were interrupted instead of curated, Pompeii reaches across time with unusual violence. It catches us off guard. We do not encounter only the grandeur of Rome there. We encounter the fragility of continuity. We encounter the uncomfortable truth that most lives, including ours, are built on assumptions of ongoingness so deep we barely notice them. There will be another meal, another repair, another appointment, another morning, another chance to explain ourselves, another week to improve the house, another season to earn more money, another year to settle the tension with the neighbor, another day to leave if leaving ever becomes necessary. Pompeii is what happens when ordinary certainty meets an event that does not care. That is why the city still interrupts the living. Not because its tragedy is larger than every other tragedy. It is not. Not because it was the most important city destroyed in antiquity. It was not. But because destruction there preserved intimacy, and intimacy is harder to defend against than greatness. Great ruins impress us. Pompeii implicates us. It does not stand at a safe monumental distance, saying admire the past. It leans closer and says, look how normal they thought they were. Look how busy. Look how alive. Look how sure there was still time. And then look at the street stones, the ovens, the shrines, the election notices, the erotic paintings. The villas, the graffiti, the damage under repair, the casts, the mountain beyond. Look at all of it together, because separating the elegant from the vulgar, the domestic from the catastrophic, the living from the dead, is exactly what Pompeii will not let you do. That refusal is its power. It was a city of appetite and ambition, ritual and display, work and pleasure, piety and vanity, ordinary routine and extraordinary vulnerability. It was not waiting to become a warning. It was trying to keep being a town. And maybe that is the last line that matters. Pompeii is not only the story of a city destroyed by a volcano, it is the story of a city that kept acting like life would continue, right until life no longer did.